Hello, this is I Go Travel with Don Barnett. I made 2 videos on my grandfather's pioneer life in Saskatchewan and Alberta. And this second video is mainly on the one on Alberta, where he left the Northwest Mounted Police and nearly died in an Alberta snowstorm. And was forced by an outlaw to handcuff 2 policemen in his adventures in the Lacombe district of central Alberta. This second video on Ed Barnett tells about Ed's life, pioneer life, after he left the Northwest Mounted Police and headed north from Fort Macleod to the Red Deer area and to what is now the community of Lacombe. Like a lot of other policemen in those days, Ed started to look beyond the police force at the good land that was available. Ed had learned carpentry skills from his father, who was a sash and door carpenter in Almont, Ontario. After resigning from the police force, Ed spent time building establishments that were the first steps toward the formation of early Alberta. And he made these notes in his diary. I helped put up the buildings occupied by George Ives about 4 miles west of the old police farm on Pincher Creek. The Garnett brothers came next to South Fork of the Old Man River, and I also helped build their house. And I worked on the government sawmill that was built by the Canadian government under the supervision of John Keane. I worked for a short time at the sawmill operated by John Keane, hauling lumber for the police barracks. The timber, mostly jack pine, was floated down the Old Man River. Later, when I arrived at the Red Deer district to the north, I helped build the store at the old Red Deer crossing, the site of the first trading post on the Calgary-Edmonton Trail. Ed eventually made his way to Calgary, and this is what he wrote about that place in the early days. There were few settlers between Macleod and Calgary in 1882. I laid over at Buck Smith's ranch at High River, the first sign of any white inhabitants. My next stop was at John Glenn's on Fish Creek, immediately south of Calgary. Shortly after leaving Glenn's ranch, I rode on until I saw Calgary in the distance. Calgary means clear running water, and it had a beautiful location at the confluence of the Bow and Elbow rivers. Calgary consisted of a police barracks similar to the ones in Fort Walsh and Macleod. The chief center of interest and activity was the I.G. Baker store, where all business and trading was done. In front of it were the common hitching posts for cowboys and Indians coming in from the surrounding country. Colonel Walker's sawmill was located near the elbow, where the elbow joins the Bow River. The logs were floated down the Bow River. The McDougall Mission stood in the center of the flat, and it was making beds to save the souls of both Indians and white men. With the increase in ranching, Calgary was becoming a cowboy's paradise. The cayuse and saddle horse were the chief means of travel everywhere. We will put Ed's diary down for a minute, and I'll tell you a little bit about Fort Calgary in those early days. Fort Calgary was not a fur trading post, but was a Northwest Mounted Police detainment site that jailed men, women, and even a few children over the years. In Canada, the word fort more often referred to a trading post or a police station like Fort Walsh, Fort Macleod, and so on, rather than to a military fort. The Edmonton-Calgary Trail here in the map originally was run as a courier by the well-known Indian runner Deerfoot, under contract as a messenger with the Northwest Mounted Police. It became busy each year with ox carts and stagecoach service in summer. But this was the outset of winter. Ed left Calgary with a team and a sled loaded with supplies. And it was nice and sunny out when he left, but by the end of the day, the clouds started to roll in, and Ed ran into a good old-fashioned Alberta snowstorm. Ed wrote the following about his experience. Before long, I was hopelessly lost. The day dragged on with the temperature dropping to 40 below zero. A howling blizzard came in from the southeast until it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I sought shelter on a cut bank on Nose Creek, just out of Calgary. The snow had drifted badly. Tying my team as best I could to the wagon, I dug a hole in a large snowbank and spread out my blankets to keep warm. It was a miserable night. I got up at daybreak to find my team had broken away. I was now on my own. My one and only hope was to follow the winding of Nose Creek back into Calgary. The blizzard blew as hard as ever, making visibility poor. The day wore on, and I traveled until nearly exhausted. Again, I camped in a snowbank. By digging around, I found a few small sticks and whittled them down to make a fire. My body was getting numb with cold, and it was essential that I get some warmth. I struck match after match, trying to get the fire started without success. The only paper I carried was my diary, kept with me from the time I had joined the force. It was a precious record, but when it came to a matter of life or death, the diary had to go. Ed did not burn his entire diary, and he rewrote his memoirs in later years. Over the night, his fire went out, and Ed was cold, and he was near death. But some people found him, either some Indian or Métis people, and he was unconscious, and they carried him over to their house. And he recovered in their house for about a week before he was well enough to travel again. Ed's second attempt in better weather resulted in him reaching the Red Deer country and eventually building one of the first stopping houses along the trail at present-day Lacombe. The old C&E trail, the Calgary-Edmonton Trail, still runs through town. Numbers have replaced names on the streets and avenues, but the main street is still called Barnett Avenue. This is the main street of Lacombe, Barnett Avenue, and just to the north of the downtown area was Ed's original stopping house. This is the Canadian Pacific Railway running along here, and just a little bit north of Ed's stopping house was Barnett Lake. This is a scan of Barnett Lake and curling on the lake in the early days. Ed wrote of the unsettled times when he first came to the Lacombe district. The summer of '84 was wet and growth was prolific. Many Indians came onto the reserves that summer, many coming in from as far south as the Missouri, where they were being sent back to Canada by the Americans after having drifted that far south in search of buffalo. They came in bands, and they were loud in their protests at being driven from their former homes. They were numerous and unsettled. Bobtail, a Cree chief, was given his allotment of land at the leavings of the Battle River. Another chief, Ermineskin, took the plains south of Wetaskiwin. A small tribe of Stonies selected a reserve west of where Ponoka is today, but disease amongst them destroyed most of the tribe, and the remainder went south to join the main band at Morley under the good guidance of John McDougall. The Indians' chiefs under Bobtail and Ermineskin were looked after by missionaries Cass and Nelson. I was a good advisor to the Indians when they chose their reserves, as I was familiar with their requirements and spoke their language some. I spent considerable time going over sections of the country with them and pointing out to them the importance of having running water through their land. This helped cement our friendship and gain respect. It was the middle of winter, And one day, Ed thought he heard some dogs barking outside. So he opened up the door, and there was two policemen in a dog team. This is a display at the Police Museum in Regina. And it was not uncommon for the police to use dog teams in winter in those days. Remember, there were no roads, only trails, and deep snow in winter. So the two policemen had a prisoner with them, a fellow by the name of Crackerbox Jones. Ed wrote in his diary what happened next. The next stop for the night was at my stopping place at Lacombe. After supper, there was no entertainment and the evening dragged. The police, knowing that Crackerbox was good at card tricks, asked him to show them a few. He agreed, but said they would have to remove his handcuffs, which they did. Seated around a small table, Crackerbox started showing tricks with the cards. At a crucial moment, while the Mounties were concentrating on how a card trick was done, he leaned over suddenly and yanked the sergeant's revolver out of his jackboot. Taken by surprise by a man who meant business and who had no intention of going to jail for a long time, the police gave up and put their hands on the table. I was washing dishes in the kitchen and came out to see what was causing all the commotion, and was confronted with a revolver pointed at my head. I quickly decided to do what I was told. Crackerbox told me to handcuff the two policemen and give him the keys. Taking the keys, he threw them down the well. And then he ordered Ed to make him a big lunch. And he said, "Ed, you pack that lunch in that sled, hook up the dogs, I'm moving south." And that's what he did. And he went out into the night, and that's the last they saw of Crackerbox. Ed wrote, "It took hours to file the handcuffs off the police. To cover their own carelessness, I was charged as an accomplice and taken to Calgary for trial. Nothing could be proven that I was in any way responsible for the escape, and I was released to find my own way back home to Lacombe at my own expense." Now, the story should have ended there, but after Ed left the Lacombe area and went out homesteading around Buffalo Lake to the east, one day, about 5 or 10 years later, he opened up his mail, and there's a letter. And it said, "You remember me? This is Crackerbox, the fella that you made a good lunch for. And I just want to thank you for packing such a good lunch. That lunch lasted me all the way across the American border. And I now live in California. These days I'm a businessman, and I've had a successful life. And thanks again for the lunch." And Ed just smiled and closed up the letter and thought about the road of life. It does take some interesting and unexpected turns. Ed continued his diary. "A few early settlers were forced to help wanted men for their own safety. They knew that a small force of police had the impossible task of carrying out the law over a vast area. On a number of occasions, I was asked by lawbreakers the safest way south to avoid being caught by the police. One could not ignore the dangers of betraying a man on the run." You know, it's never an easy time when two cultures come into contact. Ed wrote about these times in his diary. "A small tribe set up their tents in a ravine about a mile from my place. It was an ideal camping spot with a grove of young poplars with water. It wasn't long before I started having trouble with their mongrel dogs. I had just acquired a flock of 30 chickens, and their dogs started raiding my hen house and carrying away live squawking chickens to their encampment to provide a feast for dogs and people. When my chickens were half gone, I decided to get rid of Mr. Dog. Early one morning, I poked my rifle through a window of my cabin and turned him into first-class fertilizer. Not wanting to have trouble with the Indians overshooting their dog, I dragged him into a dense spruce grove in a muskeg and covered him over with brush. The Indians hung around a week trying to find their dog without success. This was Lacombe's main street in the early days. Ed met and married Elva Green, where she was Lacombe's second teacher and the first female teacher. Elva made the following note about the school. She said, "I taught school there in the old log school. While teaching in the log school, garter snakes came through the floorboards. Needless to say, we all cleared out until someone came and killed most of them." This video is about Ed Barnett, but in many ways the pioneer women in history have not had enough ink in the pages of history books. Many pioneer women, like my grandmother, often were the stabilizing force in organizing the household, doing the chores, cooking the meals, looking after the children, and equally running the ranch or farm or business. I remember my grandmother's favorite word, and that was the word persevere. If you weren't too sure on what to do, she had a word for you: persevere. If you were tired, wanted to take a break, persevere. And that word persevere really embodies the pioneer spirit that many people had. This was Ed's stopping house for overnight travelers and was known as Barnett's Rest. It was one of the earliest overnight places on the Calgary-Edmonton Trail, and he wrote the following about those times. "I built a comfortable, good-sized cabin of logs with a stone fireplace. To provide hay for my team and for travelers, I cut it with a scythe by hand, and later dried it, put it up in large piles with a fork. The hay was left outside. Horses being the only animals, they would paw aside the heavy snow mounds and eat that one, entirely consume it, and then move on to paw out another one. Deer and elk were plentiful and constantly raided my haystacks. All I had to do was to get up at dawn, stroll over to my hay supply, and knock down a nice 4-year-old buck. After a few shots, the animals finally deserted my fields, and when my meat supply got low in the spring, I found it necessary to shoot rabbits and partridges. Spring came with water lying everywhere. Ducks came back from the south in thousands and nested along the many sloughs." Ed's stopping house was called Barnett's Rest initially, and then the Canadian Pacific Railway, when it came through the Calgary-Edmonton line, they renamed it to Barnett's Siding, and it was that way for a number of years. So why is Lacombe called Lacombe today? Well, Ed got into conflict with the Canadian Pacific Railway. And when you have some difference with some of the big boys put the boots to you. Canadian Pacific wanted to buy a piece of land from Ed, but Ed refused to sell it to them. And that was the initial parting of ways. The Canadian Pacific changed the name because of this initial conflict with Ed, changed the name from Barnett to Lacombe in honor of the missionary, the famous missionary, who was really never around Lacombe at all, but he was centered in the Edmonton-Wetaskiwin area. After living in the log stopping house, Ed built this home in Lacombe with a lot of hand labor. Remember, this was in the days before electricity, so there was a lot of hand sawing of lumber and nailing it together with a regular hand hammer. Elva wrote about this house and a Halloween prank that happened there. We built a spacious home where the older children started school. In the yard at Lacombe was an old cannon. One Halloween, some of the young crowd loaded it with gunpowder and set it off. It shook the house and woke everyone up in Lacombe, a mile away. Some even thought the Riel Rebellion had broken out again. So the firing pin was removed, and that prank was never repeated. After raising his young family at Lacombe, Ed eventually sold and moved and farmed eastward in the Stettler Buffalo Lake area. Here is Ed and Elva driving their McLaughlin car. Note the right-hand side drive. Canada had not yet decided on left-hand driving vehicles like the French and Americans had, but was still indecisive about following the right-hand driving like the British. As you know, Canada finally decided that the steering wheel would be on the left-hand side. Everybody branded their cattle with brand designs, but nowadays everything is done by computer and numbers, and the old brand designs of yesterday are of no use. This was Ed's brand symbol, an upside-down wine glass. Ed and his neighbors ran into a time of cattle rustling in their area, and there was talk in the community who might the rustlers be. One day Ed visited one of his neighbors. When he sat down in the kitchen for coffee, he noticed his chair had a nice new calf robe on it. While the coffee was perking, he happened to glance down, and the new calf robe, there it was. It was his brand on the calf robe. He drank his coffee, said nothing to his neighbor, but he now knew who had been doing the recent cattle rustling. Well, if you live long enough, you will surely die. And that is what happened to Ed and Elva. They are buried in this small, rural, quiet cemetery where Elva played the organ regularly in church for many years. They are buried alongside one of their sons who died of appendicitis when he was only 23 years old. Common medical help we enjoy today just wasn't available back in those days. Some of Ed's and Elva's children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren rest in this same place. Ed and Elva, of course, were not the only pioneers to contribute to Western Canada and to the great province of Alberta, but they, like others, did their part. If you want to hear more stories and see more places, hit the subscribe button. That'll tell you when we're coming back with more videos on the internet. Until then, this is I Go Travel with Don Barnett. So long for now. I have a fairly big channel on YouTube with a lot of travel videos in it. And you shouldn't have any trouble finding it. But if you do, I've got some real good advice for you right at the very end of this video. But in the meantime, try to, on the bottom there, just Google the little @ sign at Don Barnett 5090. Click on my name first. Hit the word playlist in the middle of the page and scroll down. But if you have trouble, I've got some advice for you. Take my grandmother's advice. Persevere. Persevere.